The wind started moaning right after sundown, a low, angry sound that ripped through the pines and rattled the shingles on Flora Moore's roof. It was a sound she knew all too well. The little cabin groaned under the assault, and Flora sat by the fire, her shoulders pulled tight. Loneliness was a cold companion on nights like this, and storms had a way of prying at a house's weaknesses. Just like people, she thought. The town of Sweetwater Bluff had done the same thing to her family, pried them open, found their soft spots, and left them to break. Now she was all that was left, an outcast living on the edge of town, with nothing but shame for company. She poked at the dying embers, and a shower of sparks lit the rough-hewn walls. The cabin was a tomb of memories, every crack in the wood a whisper of what she'd lost. That's when she heard it, a sound that cut straight through the howl of the wind. A knock, sharp, deliberate, and loud. Flora froze, the poker still in her hand. Nobody ever came out here, especially not in a storm. The people of Sweetwater Bluff kept their distance, and they had ever since the town judge branded her parents as thieves. The knock came again, harder this time, more insistent, her heart hammered against her ribs. Every story she'd ever heard about desperate men and lonely cabins rushed into her mind. A woman alone was easy prey. She knew that better than anyone. Gripping the iron poker, her knuckles turning white, she crept toward the door. "Who's there?" Her voice was a bare tremor, lost in the roar of the rain. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then a man's voice, low and rough, cut through the noise. "Shelter," he said. "Nothing more." The sound of it stirred something in her, something old and forgotten. She hesitated, her mind racing, then slid the bolt. The door flew inward with a crash, blasted open by the wind, and a spray of icy rain hit her face. A man filled the doorway. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and soaked to the bone, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. He just stood there, braced against the gale as if it might try to drag him back out into the night. Flora raised the poker. "I've only got one bed," she warned, her voice shaking. The man's eyes met hers. They were dark and steady, like wet river stones. "The floor is fine," he said. Something in the way he held himself calmed her fear, just a little. He stepped inside, careful not to crowd her, and pushed the door shut against the storm. The wind howled outside, but inside there was only the sound of water dripping from his coat and the frantic beat of her own heart. He finally broke the silence. "Name's Jed," he said, his voice raw from the cold. Then he added a single word that made the air in the cabin crackle. "Apache." Flora went rigid. That word carried a heavy weight in Sweetwater Bluff. It meant suspicion. It meant fear. She'd heard the townsfolk curse the Apache as killers and thieves her entire life. But there was no threat in his voice, just a simple statement of fact. She lowered the poker an inch. "Flora Moore," she replied, the name feeling like ash in her mouth. At that, Jed's gaze sharpened. He stared at her, really looked at her, as if trying to place a face he hadn't seen in a very long time. "Moore," he repeated slowly, the sound rumbling in his chest. "Your father, was his name Daniel Moore?" Flora's throat went dry. "You knew him." Jed moved toward the fire, leaving a trail of water on the floorboards. He held his hands out to the warmth, his back to her. "Knew him? Yes, him and your mother." He paused, the firelight casting long shadows across the room. "A long time ago, your folks gave shelter and a hot meal to a half-starved Apache boy. The town wanted to leave him for dead. I was that boy." The words hit her like a physical blow. The poker slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the stone hearth. All her life, she had lived under the shadow of her parents' disgrace. Their name was a curse whispered in the street. And now this stranger, this Apache man, was standing in her cabin telling a different story, a story of kindness. "You're mistaken," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Everyone in town knows what they did. They were thieves. That's the only story there is." Jed turned to face her, the firelight catching the hard, weathered lines of his face. "I remember more," he said, his voice low and intense. "I remember your mother's bread, still warm from the oven. I remember your father standing between me and a mob of men who wanted my hide for no reason other than my blood. Thieves don't risk their lives for a hungry stranger, Miss Moore. Don't let them tell you otherwise. Flora's chest felt tight, like a band was squeezing her lungs. She wanted to believe him, wanted it so badly it hurt, but the weight of all those years, all those cold stares and hateful whispers, was too much. You can't know, she choked out. You don't know what it's been like. His gaze softened, but his voice was still firm as rock. I know what it's like to be an outcast. They call you the daughter of thieves. They call me a savage. It's the same story, just with different words. They repeat a lie long enough, and you start to believe it yourself. But I owe your parents my life, Flora Moore, and I will not believe the lies this town tells. She turned away, fumbling with the kettle, her hands shaking too much to hold it steady. His words had found every crack in the walls she had built around her heart. For so long she had accepted the town's verdict. It was easier than fighting. But now this man was offering her another memory, one of courage and decency. The fire popped and hissed in the sudden silence. Finally, she set the poker back in its stand and pulled her shawl tighter. The floor is yours, she murmured, not meeting his eyes. But in the morning, you have to go. Jed nodded slowly. Morning will come, he said, but storms have a way of revealing the truth. He spread his wet coat to dry by the fire and settled onto the rough floorboards with a quiet dignity that needed no apology. Flora watched him from the shadows, her heart a tangled mess of hope and fear. She told herself he was just a stranger passing through, a ghost from a past that wasn't hers. But as the storm raged on, his words echoed in her mind. Thieves don't risk themselves for the hungry. Outside, the wind howled its fury, but inside the small cabin, a different kind of storm was just beginning. By morning, the storm had broken, leaving behind a sky the color of slate and a world dripping with rain. Flora woke from a restless sleep, the dreams of the night already fading like mist. She rose quietly, careful not to wake the man by the fire. Jed lay wrapped in his blanket, his face turned toward the dying embers. Even asleep, he looked like a man expecting trouble. She told herself again that he would be gone by noon. It was for the best. The whispers that followed her through town were bad enough. She didn't need to add harboring an Apache to the list. Still, his words haunted her. They had been good people. She put the kettle on and measured out the last of her coffee grounds. As the bitter smell filled the cabin, Jed stirred. He sat up, the blanket falling from his shoulders. Morning, he said, his voice still rough. Flora just nodded. There's coffee. It's weak. He took the tin cup she offered without a word. They drank in silence, the only sound the steady drip of rain from the eaves. When they were finished, Jed stood and pulled on his still damp coat. I'm heading to town, he announced. Need to get some supplies. Flora's head snapped up. They won't be kind to you in town, Jed. A faint, hard smile touched his lips. I've seen unkind before. Before she could argue, he was gone, disappearing into the gray, misty morning. The hours that followed were long and heavy. Flora tried to keep busy, mending a shirt, sweeping the floor, but her mind kept drifting. She could almost hear her mother's voice, a gentle whisper on the rain-soaked wind. Truth will outlast the gossip, Flora. But it hadn't. The truth was buried with her parents in the cold ground, while their names were still dragged through the mud. Late in the morning, she heard the sound of a horse. Her heart leaped into her throat. She ran to the window and saw Jed, leading his bay horse, a small sack slung over his shoulder. When he stepped inside, he didn't just carry flour and salt. He carried trouble. I told you not to go, she said, her voice sharp with fear. They'll talk. They'll say things. They're already saying things, he cut in, his voice calm and flat. He placed the sack on the table. I heard plenty. Her hands trembled. What did they say? Jed's dark eyes met hers, and he didn't soften the blow. They said you're the daughter of thieves. They said no decent person would set foot in this cabin. One man spat on the ground when I walked by. Another laughed and said you were probably just like your parents. The words were like a slap. Flora turned away, a burning shame rising in her chest. Then you see, she whispered. You see why you can't stay here. He was silent for a moment. Then he said, they talk about me the same way, Flora. Savage, half-breed. But their words don't tell me who I am. And they shouldn't tell you who you are either. Her shoulders shook. It's easy for you to say. You weren't born with their name, their shame. No, he said softly, but I was born with a face they hate. It's the same story, Flora, just different words. He took a step closer. Tell me something. Do you believe it? Do you believe your parents were thieves? Her breath hitched. She looked up, her eyes burning with unshed tears. Sometimes, I think they must have been. Why else would a whole town turn against them? The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. It was the question that had poisoned her life. Jed's gaze was unwavering, cutting through her doubt. I believe what I saw with my own two eyes, he said, his voice low and fierce. I saw your mother give bread to a boy she didn't know, even though the town would curse her for it. I saw your father stand between me and men with rifles. That's the truth I carry. If they were greedy people, I wouldn't be alive today. Don't let a town full of lies make you forget the truth of their hearts. The room was so still, she could hear the water dripping into the bucket by the door. She stared at the floor, his words sinking into her like stones in a deep well. Could it be true? Could her memories, the warmth in her mother's smile, the strength in her father's hands, be stronger than the town's verdict? A single tear slid down her cheek, hot and sharp. She hated crying in front of him, hated showing this weakness, but she couldn't stop them. Jed didn't move to comfort her. He just stood there, a solid presence in her crumbling world. I owe your parents a debt, he said. That debt doesn't disappear just because powerful men wrote a different story. They were good people, Flora. They were brave. Don't let their memory die this way. His words didn't just offer comfort, they offered a challenge. Later that afternoon, as she was gathering firewood, Jed came out with the axe. He split the logs with a clean, powerful rhythm that seemed to echo the strength in his voice. As he stacked the wood against the cabin wall, she found herself speaking her fear aloud. You'll be gone tomorrow, won't you? He paused, leaning on the axe handle, and looked at her. Is that what you want? She opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. She was terrified of the whispers, of the scorn, of what his presence would cost her. But the silence in the cabin no longer felt like a tomb when he was there. It felt like a home. Maybe, she said, her voice barely a whisper, one more night. A small, almost imperceptible nod was his only reply. But she saw the corner of his mouth twitch, just for a second, as if he knew that some storms change more than just the weather. That night, the quiet between them felt different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with unspoken things, with the weight of the past and the fragile possibility of a future. As she banked the fire for the night, Jed spoke from the shadows. Storms test a house, Flora, he said, his voice low. They find the weak spots. They show you what's strong enough to hold. Sometimes you don't know what you're made of until the wind starts to blow. She looked at him then, at the firelight dancing in his dark eyes, and for the first time in a long, long time, she felt the faint, dangerous flicker of hope. The next day, a strange quiet settled over the cabin, but it wasn't the lonely quiet Flora was used to. It was a shared silence, a comfortable space between two people who understood each other without needing words. Jed didn't push, he didn't pry. He simply existed in her space, and with his presence, things began to change. He started by fixing the roof. For years, a leak over her bed had been a constant reminder of her decay. Every spring storm meant another sleepless night, listening to the drip, drip, drip into the tin pan on the floor. Jed climbed up onto the shingles without a word, and by evening, the leak was gone. That night, when a soft rain began to fall, Flora lay in her bed and listened to the silence above her head. She wept, not from sadness, but from the simple, overwhelming relief of being dry. He moved on to the fence, then the broken latch on the shed door, then the wobbly leg of her kitchen table. He worked with a steady, relentless purpose, mending the broken pieces of her life one by one. And as he worked, something inside Flora began to mend too. The constant tremor in her hands eased. The knot of fear in her stomach loosened its grip. In the evenings, he would sit by the fire and whittle small animals from scraps of wood. A hawk with outstretched wings, a lean wolf, a patient bear. He never gave them to her, just left them on the hearth, small, silent offerings that slowly populated her lonely home. But the peace inside the cabin was a fragile thing, and the world outside was closing in. She knew the whispers in Sweetwater Bluff must be growing louder by the day. Flora Moore, the thief's daughter, has taken in an Apache. She could picture their faces, twisted with scorn and self-righteous glee. The thought of it was a constant gnawing dread. One evening, as Jed was stacking the last of the firewood, the fear boiled over. "You can't stay, Jed," she blurted out, her voice tight with panic. "They're talking. I know they are." He didn't stop his work. "Let them talk." "You don't understand," she cried, her voice rising. "Every time I go into that town, I can feel their eyes on my back. I can hear them laughing. If they know you're here, it will only get worse. I can't take any more." Jed placed the last log on the pile with careful precision. Then he straightened up and turned to face her. His expression was calm, but his voice was like iron. "I understand more than you know, Flora. I've spent my life with their hate at my back. They whisper about you. They throw stones at me. Do you really think sending me away will make them respect you? It won't. They'll just find another reason to scorn you. Honor isn't something they give you, Flora. It's something you hold on to, inside yourself." Tears stung her eyes. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him he was wrong, that he couldn't possibly understand the particular shame of being Flora Moore. But as she looked into his face, she saw the truth of his words carved into the lines around his eyes. He had borne this same weight, this same undeserved contempt, his entire life, and he was still standing. "It's different for a woman," she whispered, ashamed of her own weakness. He didn't argue. He just said, "Different storms, same wind." Later that night, as the fire burned low, she found herself speaking of things she hadn't said aloud in years. "When I was a little girl," she began, her voice soft, "I used to believe my parents were innocent. I swore I would prove it one day, but as I got older, it was just easier to believe the whispers. It hurt less." Jed looked at her from across the hearth, his eyes catching the firelight. "Kindness isn't a lie, Flora. I saw it in them, and you know it too. Don't let them steal that memory from you." She didn't answer, but long after Jed was asleep on the floor, she sat staring into the flames, a battle raging in her heart. The next morning, something shifted. While cleaning, she found herself dragging out an old heavy trunk that had belonged to her father. She hadn't opened it in a decade. A cloud of dust billowed out as she lifted the lid. Inside was a life packed away, a few faded shirts, a worn Bible, a pocket knife. And at the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small, leather-bound book. Her heart started to pound. With trembling fingers, she opened it. It was her father's ledger. Page after page of his neat, careful handwriting detailed every transaction, every plank of lumber bought, every sack of flour sold. But it was the last entry that made the air leave her lungs. In clear, steady script, her father had written, "Judge Matson insists on holding the school fund in his office safe, says it's for the town's own good. I argued against it, but he is a stubborn man." Flora read the words again, and then a third time. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold the book. If the judge had the money, how could her father have stolen it? She took the ledger to Jed. He read the entry, his dark eyes missing nothing. "This isn't the record of a thief," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "This is the work of an honest man." "But why?" she whispered, her mind reeling. "Why did no one believe him? Why did this never come out?" Jed closed the book gently. "Because powerful men don't like their mistakes brought into the light. It's always easier to blame the man who can't fight back." The truth was a heavy, suffocating weight. For years she had lived in a prison of doubt, but now she held the key. But with that key came a new, terrifying fear. The men who had buried her parents with lies would not stand by and let a dead man's words undo their work. They would come for her. "If I show this to anyone," she said, her voice small, "they'll destroy me." Jed leaned forward, his gaze locking with hers, intense and unwavering. "Then they'll have to destroy both of us." That evening, the ledger lay open on the table, its ink black and damning in the lamplight. She thought of her mother's words. Truth will outlast the gossip. For the first time, she felt a flicker of belief. She looked at Jed, who was mending the door latch with quiet focus. Then she reached out and closed the book. Her decision made. She would not let them be buried by a lie any longer. The ledger sat on the table like a loaded gun. Every time Flora looked at it, her stomach twisted into a knot of fear and a strange, fierce hope. Jed never pushed. He just said, "Keep it safe. The time will come," and went back to his work, as calm and steady as the mountains themselves. But Sweetwater Bluff was a small town, and secrets had a way of seeping out like water through cracked earth. Jed's presence, his trips to town for supplies, her own newfound resolve, it was all being watched. On the third morning, the sound of hoofbeats echoed down the valley. It wasn't one horse. It was several, their gait heavy and purposeful. Flora's hand flew to her throat. Through the window, she saw him, Harlan Pierce, the wealthiest rancher in the valley, a man whose power was as vast as his land. He rode a magnificent chestnut gelding, and two hard-faced men with rifles flanked him like wolves. Pierce dismounted as if he owned the very ground Flora stood on. His boots hit the porch steps with an arrogant thud, and he pounded on the door without waiting for an invitation. Jed was on his feet in an instant, but Flora put a hand on his arm. "This is my home," she whispered, her heart hammering. She took a deep breath and opened the door. "Miss Moore," Pierce said, his voice as smooth and cold as a winter creek. His eyes, however, were sharp and hungry. "I've heard you have a guest. I thought it was time we had a talk." "What do you want, Mr. Pierce?" Flora asked, forcing her voice to stay even. His lips stretched into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Business. This little plot of land you're on. It should have been mine years ago. Your father left some significant debts." He let the lie hang in the air. Debts that are now long overdue. Before she could answer, Jed stepped forward, moving to stand slightly in front of her. He was as still and solid as an old-growth pine. "Her father kept careful records," Jed said, his voice low and even. "He owed no one." Pierce's gaze flickered to Jed, his eyes filled with a casual, brutal disdain. "And who are you? The new hired hand? Or has the Moore reputation fallen even lower than I thought?" Heat flooded Flora's cheeks, but Jed didn't even flinch. "My name is Jed, and I've read the records." One of Pierce's men snickered. Pierce shot him a look that silenced him instantly. He turned back to Flora, his voice dripping with false concern. "A woman alone must be so careful of the company she keeps, Miss Moore. Especially a woman with your family's history." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Take my advice. Pack your things. This land is about to become part of my ranch. The law is already involved. It would be much less unpleasant for you if you were gone before they arrive." The old panic surged through Flora. The urge to run, to disappear into the wilderness and leave the ghosts of Sweetwater Bluff behind, was almost overwhelming. But then she felt Jed's hand, a light, steadying touch on the doorframe beside her. His voice was quiet, but it cut through Pierce's threats like a knife. "If the law comes," Jed said, "it will come for the truth. And the truth, Pierce, is not on your side." For the first time, a crack appeared in the rancher's arrogant facade. He looked from Jed to Flora and back again, as if seeing something he hadn't expected. Not weakness, but strength. He straightened up, brushing a piece of non-existent lint from his expensive coat. "You've had your warning," he said, his voice flat and cold. He tipped his hat in a gesture of pure mockery and swung back onto his horse. As he rode away, the sun glinted off the rifles his men carried. The moment they were gone, Flora's legs gave out, and she sagged against the door. "He's not bluffing, Jed. He'll take everything." Jed turned to her, his expression grim. "If you run, he wins. He gets the land, and he gets to keep the lie alive. But if you stand your ground, Flora, if you fight, you might just win it all back." Tears of frustration and fear burned her eyes. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." His hand brushed against her shawl, a gesture so fleeting it was barely there. "Strength isn't about not being afraid," he said softly. "It's about being afraid and standing anyway. I'll stand with you." Those 4 words, "I'll stand with you," broke something open inside her. For years, she had carried this burden in silence, alone. Now the silence was broken. That night, she sat with the ledger, tracing her father's words with a trembling finger. "If I take this into town," she whispered, "they'll tear me to pieces." Jed looked up from the piece of wood he was carving. "Then we'll go together." She stared at him, her heart aching. "Why? This isn't your fight." He set down his knife and leaned forward, his eyes deep and serious. "Your parents saved my life. That's a debt I can never fully repay. But there's more to it than that." His voice dropped, filled with a lifetime of pain. "I know what it feels like to have your name stolen from you, to be called a thief when you've done nothing wrong. I will not let their lie stand. Not for your father's memory, and not for you." She was tired of being afraid. She was tired of hiding. Slowly, deliberately, she closed the ledger and placed her hand flat on its cover. "Then we'll stand," she said. A single firm nod from Jed was his only reply. But in the firelight, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Pride, maybe, or relief. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the long winter of her life was finally beginning to thaw. The time for hiding was over. The air in Sweetwater Bluff was thick with dust and suspicion as Flora and Jed walked down the main street. The ledger was in her basket, a heavy, dangerous weight wrapped in her mother's scarf. Jed walked beside her, a silent, unmovable mountain of a man. His presence was a shield, but she could still feel the eyes. From the blacksmith's forge, from the windows of the saloon, from the faces of the women in the general store, the stares were like 1,000 tiny needles against her skin, and the whispers followed them like a plague. "There she is, the Moore girl, and that Apache. They say he's been living with her, shameless, just like her father." Flora kept her eyes fixed on the town square, her knuckles white where she gripped the handle of her basket. This was it. The moment she had dreaded and, somewhere deep down, longed for her entire life. In the center of the square stood a rough wooden platform used for auctions and announcements. Jed led her to it and helped her up. Standing there looking down at the faces of the people who had scorned her for so long made her feel dizzy with fear. A hush fell over the crowd. Jed's voice broke the silence. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made everyone stop and listen. "You all call her parents thieves," he began, his voice ringing with conviction. "You buried them under that name. But I knew them. They saved my life when no one else in this town would lift a finger. And I am telling you now, the guilty man was not Daniel Moore." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone laughed. "What's an Apache know about honest men?" a voice called out. Flora's heart hammered. She felt Jed's eyes on her, urging her on. This had to be her voice, her truth. She pulled the ledger from her basket and held it high, her hands shaking. "This was my father's," she said, her voice thin at first, then gaining strength. "His accounts, every penny recorded, and on the last page." She opened the book, her finger tracing the faded ink. "On the last page, he wrote that Judge Matson took the school fund for safekeeping. How could my father steal money he never had?" Gas spread through the crowd. People looked at each other, their certainty starting to crumble. Then a figure pushed through the throng. It was Harlan Pierce, his face a mask of cold fury. He strode to the platform, his boots pounding on the wood. "Lies," he spat. "The convenient scribblings of a dead man. How easy to write such things when you're not around to be questioned." Flora faltered, the force of his anger like a physical blow. But Jed stepped forward, placing himself between her and Pierce. "Truth doesn't need a dead man to defend it," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "It stands on its own." Pierce sneered. "And what would you know of truth, Apache? You ride into town, fill this pathetic woman's head with wild stories, and now you think you can rewrite history? She's desperate. You're just taking advantage of her." But before Jed could reply, another voice cut through the air. It was old and frail, but clear as a bell. "It's not a story, it's a memory." The crowd parted to let a stooped figure through. It was Reverend Alcott, the town's first preacher, a man so old most had forgotten he was still alive. He leaned heavily on his cane, but his eyes were sharp. "I was there," the old man said, his voice trembling with the weight of his confession. "I was in the office that night. I saw Judge Matson take the strongbox. Daniel Moore argued with him, told him it was wrong to hold the town's money without oversight. And for that, for his honesty, Matson and others branded him a thief." The Reverend's voice broke. "And I stayed silent. God forgive me. I was a coward, and I stayed silent." The square exploded into chaos. Shouts of outrage, disbelief, and anger filled the air. Pierce's face went dark with rage. "You old fool," he roared at the Reverend. "Your mind is gone. You don't know what you're saying." But Flora's voice rose above the din, no longer trembling, but forged into steel by years of pain. "He knows exactly what he's saying," she cried, pointing a shaking finger at Pierce. "And so do you. You all condemn them. You let them die in disgrace to protect the powerful. Look at this book." She held the ledger up again, a symbol of the truth they had tried to bury. "If you can't face what's written here, it's not my father's ghost you're afraid of. It's your own." A stunned, heavy silence fell over the square. In that silence, Jed reached out and took her hand. He didn't raise it in victory. He just held it, his grip firm and steady, a silent vow for all to see. "These people," he said, his voice resonating with a deep, quiet power, "showed me kindness when I was just a boy, an outcast they had every reason to fear. They paid a price for that kindness. I will not let their daughter stand alone now." The words hung in the air, undeniable and true. Pierce's face was a twisted knot of hatred, but he was beaten. He knew it. The lie was broken. Without another word, he turned and shoved his way through the silent crowd, his henchmen trailing behind him like beaten dogs. As the townspeople slowly began to disperse, their faces a mixture of shame and confusion, Flora's strength finally gave out. She sagged against Jed, the adrenaline leaving her weak and trembling. "I did it," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He put his arm around her, holding her steady. "You stood, Flora," he said, his voice rough with pride. "That's everything." Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time in her life, they were not tears of shame or grief. They were tears of release. She had faced the monster, and she had won. She was not alone. Back at the cabin, the ledger now rested on the hearth, not as a weapon, but as a testament. The whispers in town didn't stop overnight, but they changed. They were no longer sharp with scorn, but soft with guilt and a grudging respect. People started to nod when she passed, their eyes holding a new understanding. The heavy chains of her parents' shame had finally fallen away. Life settled into a new rhythm, one of healing and quiet growth. Jed mended the fences while Flora coaxed a garden from the neglected earth. They worked side by side, the silence between them no longer a void, but a shared space of peace and understanding. One evening, as the sun bled gold and purple across the valley, Jed returned from town. He placed a folded piece of paper on the table without a word. "What is it?" Flora asked, wiping the dirt from her hands. "The deed," he said simply, "to this cabin, to this land. Pierce has dropped his claim. It's yours now, free and clear." She picked up the paper, her hands trembling as she read the official words. It was real. This place, this small patch of earth that held all her memories, was finally, truly hers. Tears welled in her eyes. "Jed, I... how can I ever..." "You don't owe me anything," he cut in, his voice firm. "This was stolen from your family. All I did was help you take it back." She pressed the deed to her chest, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. For so long, she had been a ghost, haunting the edges of a town that despised her. Now she had ground beneath her feet again. She had a home. Winter arrived with a soft, silent fall of snow that blanketed the valley in a pristine white. The cabin was warm and secure, the roof no longer leaking, the walls no longer groaning in the wind. Jed's hands had made it strong. One night, as they sat by the fire, Jed reached into his coat. He pulled out a small deerskin pouch and carefully unwrapped what was inside. It was a simple silver band, etched with the image of a running horse, the metal worn smooth by time. Among my people, he said, his voice low and solemn, a man gives this when he chooses his partner for life. It is not a promise of wealth, it is a vow. Plain and steady. He held it out to her, the silver glowing in the firelight. Flora, if you will have it, this home will be ours. Not just yours. Not just mine. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked from the silver band to his dark, serious eyes. She thought of all the lonely nights, of the endless whispers, of the crushing weight of a name she couldn't escape. And she thought of this man who had walked out of a storm and into her life, who had seen past the outcast and found the woman underneath. With a trembling hand, she reached out and took the band. Jed, she whispered, her voice breaking, all my life I've just wanted someone to see me. Not the Moore name, not the town's shame, just Flora. A tear slipped down her cheek. You gave me back my home. You gave me back my name. But you also gave me a place to belong. She closed her hand around the silver, its coolness a solid, real thing against her palm. Yes, she said, her voice filled with a joy so profound it was almost painful. Yes, I'll have it. He didn't smile. Not exactly, but a deep warmth filled his eyes. He reached across the hearth and took her hand, his rough, strong fingers closing around hers. In that moment, the last vestiges of her loneliness dissolved, melting away like snow in the spring sun. The world outside was quiet, wrapped in a blanket of white, but inside the cabin, a new fire burned bright, a promise of all the winters yet to come. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the silver band clutched in her hand, and closed her eyes. The storm had passed, and in its wake, something new and beautiful had taken root. She was finally home. Thank you for sticking with this story until the very end. Your time and attention mean the world to me. If this story of justice and redemption touched your heart, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel. It helps me continue to find and share stories just like this one.